Hello, everyone, and welcome to X University Powwow Education Week. This is our Métis beadwork inspired dot art with Marissa Magneson. Marissa did a workshop earlier with us this week, which was really great, so I hope you caught that. But today she'll be taking us through some dot art. So now I will pass it over to her.
Awesome. Thank you. So Tansi Marissa Magneson Nisigasan. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Marissa, as previously introduced. I am Cree-Métis, and today we are going to look at a little bit of what makes Métis beadwork unique, some key characteristics, not all, and then draw some inspiration from that and from the land to make our own dot art. So to start, I'm going to start by showing you a piece by Christy Belcourt and kind of use that as our example to walk through some design elements. I also want to open it up that if anybody has any questions at any point, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, throw it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with, and I'd be happy to do my best to answer those throughout. So when you look at paintings inspired by Métis beadwork, like that of Christy Belcourt, you'll notice a few things that are quite common. And that first thing I'm going to talk about is the symmetry. So if you were to divide this painting in half, you'll notice that both sides are fairly symmetrical. Every once in a while, there is a flower or a small detail that is a little bit different. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. But that symmetry is quite common. And where this comes from is actually the symmetry in our clothing. So Métis people, we traveled around quite a lot. We still travel around quite a lot. And so we would wear our beadwork rather than having beadwork on, say, something decorative that you're going to hang in your home. It was done mostly on jackets and moccasins and leggings and mittens and things like that. And because people are also kind of symmetrical. Obviously, you know, the left and right side is a little bit different for everybody. But because we have two shoulders, we would bead two flowers, for example. And same with our moccasins, which is common with other cultures, not just Métis people. But this is where that inspiration comes from, right? So having that symmetrical design reflected on the left and the right side has then been interpreted into paintings like Christie's work. Something else that you'll notice that is unique to and specific to Métis work is these little white vines that connect all of the different flowers. And these are called mouse tracks. And that is because these are the tracks that mice leave in the snow. And so drawing inspiration from that, these tracks often connect elements and ideas together. So like many different forms of beadwork, sometimes your beadwork will tell a story, and these vines help connect those stories together. You'll also notice that a lot of Métis work is incorporating flower designs. These flowers are inspired by the environment, so sometimes certain flower patterns can connect to certain families. Sometimes they can connect to certain communities. And again, as we travel around, we pick up different patterns along the way, right? So Métis people are known as the flower beadwork people. We aren't the only people that incorporate flowers into our designs, obviously, but it is something that often stands out as a key characteristic of Métis work. So those are a few things I wanted to touch upon before we get into our own dot art today. But does anybody have any questions before we start painting? No? Okay, if you do, feel free to drop it in the chat. So I'm going to show you a few examples of some pieces that I have created. I have this one flower that I painted, and I'm trying to look for the example. So this piece was inspired by this tufted and beaded medicine pouch. And I just took one of these flowers and then translated it into dot art. Again, drawing from where this art form came from, and that's inspired by beadwork. There are a few other pieces that I have done of a simple flower with the mouse tracks. These two are inspired by Christy Belcourt's other book, which is Medicines to Help Us. And in this book, it looks at different medicine plants, their name in various languages, including Michif, which is one of the Métis languages. She sketches it out. There's a picture where you can find it, and then how she has turned that into dot art. So if you are interested in learning more about plants and medicines or dot art itself, or if you're a fan of Christy Belcourt, this is a really great book and resource to have. So I took inspiration from this book and started making my own versions of blueberries and another plant. And then there's one more I wanted to show you. So this piece is actually in the yard. I'm very lucky to be growing sage. And so at one point in the summer, I noticed that my sage was starting to flower. And so I actually spent some time over a couple of days really observing the plant and watching it grow. And I decided to turn that, took a photograph of it and then turned it into dot art. So one thing that Christy mentioned to me when I was talking about her practice and asking her questions was to actually sketch out the flower of the plant that you're drawing inspiration from, and then simplifying it to the outlines, just like you would in beadwork, because you can't necessarily depict every little detail, but you can with a little bit of shading. So that's just one tip as you're going through this practice with me today, is to simplify any kind of the outlines. And I'm going to walk you through that right now. So we're coming up to the end of September, and I know we're not quite in November, but for anybody who's a bead worker, I'm sure many people are working on their poppies for November, because these poppies, they take a long time to bead. So I was going to draw inspiration from this poppy that I have already beaded here. And I'm actually going to do it the same way I would with my beadwork. So I am a beadworker before exploring this form of painting. And so the way I approach it is very much similar to the way I approach my beadwork. So what I've done is, this is actually the template that I use to create my poppies. And I have drawn out the outline and then added in the crosses here, as well as the center. I then drew a stem with some mouse tracks because I wanted to draw inspiration from that traditional Métis mouse track design that we saw earlier. So the actual practice of dot art is very simple. It's just a little bit time consuming because you have to do every little dot individually, but it's very similar to beadwork of tacking down those beads one at a time. So to start, I'm just taking some acrylic paint and putting it onto my, my tray here. And you can use a lot of different things to create your dots. You can use toothpicks at the end of a pin, barbecue skewers, anything that will make a dot essentially. But today I'm using some little knitting needles. And I'm going to go into my paint and just take a little bit from the end. And I'm going to start by doing the outline, because that's the way that I do my beadwork. I do all of my outlines first and my fill last. So you can start anywhere on your canvas or your piece of paper. And every 1 or 2 dots, I'm just going back for a little bit more paint. The one thing I didn't talk about earlier, but I'm going to talk about now, is you'll notice that I'm painting on black paper. And this is also inspired by the beadwork. So often you'll see Métis beadwork done on black velvet or other dark colors. And that really allows the beads to pop. So taking inspiration from that, you'll find that dot art is a lot of the time done on black paper, or sorry, a black background. So I'm just going around one dot at a time. And when you're creating your design, think of some of the plants that are growing around you, and see if you can draw inspiration from that. Or if you're a bead worker, maybe there's a piece of beadwork that you have already made that you want to kind of replicate in this art form. When you are making the dots, it's important to just be cautious of where your hand is sitting. And if you are crossing over, to make sure that your hand is not resting on your surface, or else you're going to smudge your dots, which we don't want to do. So I'm just rotating it as I go around to avoid smudging it. And if you notice that your dots are either super pointy, like the paint's kind of clumping together, or they're not very regular, there could be a couple of things that are happening. Your paint might be too thick, and you can just add a little bit of water and that will help thin it out. Another thing is your pressure that you're applying. So you'll notice the camera's pretty far back, but you can already see some of these dots are inconsistent in shape and size, which for me, I don't mind, because I know that beads are like that. My beads, even contemporary beads, but for anybody who works with vintage beads as well, you'll notice that they vary in shape and size. So I don't mind my dots varying, but as you practice this art form more, you'll become a little bit more consistent in how much paint you continue to pick up, as well as how hard you press the paint into your material. So those two things do factor into the size of your dots. As well, you might notice that your paint will start to kind of harden around whatever you're using. And so it's just every once in a while, it's good to wipe it off on a piece of paper towel or something like that, and then go back in for some fresh paint. As I'm working through, like the reason why I only put a small dot of paint onto my tray is because acrylic paint dries pretty fast. And so as I'm working, it will naturally just clump up on its own. And so if that happens, what I'll do is I'll just put my tool into the paint and stir it around. If it's really getting clumpy, then I'll just get some fresh paint too. So that's why I didn't lay out all of my colors first. I just pick up colors as I go. Now, if you really want your work to pop, after you've done your outline, you can pick a different shade of the same color to fill in. Just like I've done on this poppy here, I have a darker red that's outlining and a different red that's filled in the middle. And this just helps my outline pop and be different from the rest of it. And so I'm going to do that with my my fill as well. So you can just mix in some white or some black, depending on if you want to go lighter or darker. And there's no right or wrong way for how to fill in. It's really up to you. And if you're a bead worker, you'll know maybe which way you prefer to do it. Some people will fill in their poppies by following that outline all the way into the center. For me, I like to do diagonal stripes all the way. For anybody who's ever beaded a circle, you'll know that you can put one bead in the center and exactly 7 beads will fit around that center bead. So then 7 around there. I'm going to do one more row. Now I'm just going to lighten up my red that's already on my tray here, so I can begin filling in. I'm just going to use another toothpick to mix those. Probably going to be a pink because I put way too much white here, but that's okay. We're going to have like a pink poppy today. So there's a lot of different types of dot art. And this dot art is, like I said, drawing inspiration from Métis beadwork. But if you look all across the world, you'll notice that there's a lot of different cultures that are painting with dots. You see that in India, in Australian Aborigine art, in French Impressionist paintings. But each one of these styles has their own unique characteristics. And so if you look at French Impressionist paintings, you'll notice that the dots more so overlap with one another, whereas these dots, they're spaced out so that you can imagine each dot as a bead. So as best as I can, I try and avoid the dots from touching one another. And also doing my best to space them out fairly evenly. Again, the slower you work, the more precise you are. I'm kind of going quickly for today's demo. If you take your time, you can make some really nice dots. And just for the sake of time, we won't be exploring that mirror image that I was talking about earlier, but I'm just showing one design element that could be in a larger painting. So this form of art, sometimes you might hear people say, and I know I've said this in the past myself, of calling it Métis dot art. But actually, after talking to Christy Belcourt, I started to realize through her explanation to me that we're not quite at a point of calling it Métis dot art. And the reason is because Métis people across the homelands in Ontario and the prairies, BC, East Coast, West Coast, up north, etc. Not all communities have adopted this art form. And it's a very recent and contemporary art form. So it started off with Christy Belcourt around the 90s, and it's growing in popularity. So we're seeing it more and more, especially here in Ontario, but we're not quite at the point where it's being adopted in all communities. So that is why today we're calling it bead art painting or dot art inspired by Métis beadwork, but not Métis dot art. So I can't see anybody who is following along with this workshop live, but I'm curious to know if there's anybody who is trying this at home and what they are deciding to paint or draw inspiration from today. You can either unmute yourself, or if you want to just throw it in the chat, I'd love to hear. Or if you have questions too. So there's one petal that's filled in now. I'm just gonna quickly fill in the next petal here. So I'm going to leave the petals and actually start working on the vine so I can talk a little bit more about that. So this vine, like I said, it's called mouse tracks. And mouse tracks are often done in white, if I have enough white paint left here. There we go. But they can also be done in other colors. Don't think I have an example nearby, but they can be done in brown or whatever color you want as well. But today we're going to use some white. Oh, I'm just noticing in the chat that there's someone who is doing a simple flower in their favorite Halloween colors. Oh, I love that. Someone else is doing a sketch in pencil and ink on some graph paper. Very nice. And another person is just listening and thinking about their next beading project. Awesome. Yeah, and actually I've been thinking about how this type of art form, because it's a little bit quicker than beading, that you could actually reverse it and sketch out your designs through dot art and then incorporate them into your beadwork. So it could kind of go one way or the other, right? So this long line here is the tail that the mouse is leaving behind. And then these V marks are the feet. So that's how the tracks are made. So to start, I always do the line first, the trail of the tail, and then I go back with the feet. And I try to space them out fairly similarly. Although every step we take, it can vary, right? So. Oh, and I see someone else is following along with a poppy design. And they said it's so peaceful to do so, and they're enjoying the beading tips. Oh, thank you. Yeah, once you get into a rhythm of it, I find that dot art, like beadwork, can be very meditative. Once you're all set up, and it's just one dot at a time. It's also a really good way of visualizing beadwork for those who have never done beadwork before, to actually get your mind thinking about the ways to approach beadwork in a little bit of a simpler way. So sometimes, especially with younger kids, I'll have them do dot art before we do beadwork together, just so they can already start thinking about, you know, we're gonna do the outlines first, and then we're gonna fill it in last. And if you don't have paint, I should have mentioned this in the beginning, but if you don't have paint, you can also use just markers or any pencil kind of tool that you have to just make little dots. And you can explore it that way as well. The nice thing about this type of art form is you don't have to have a lot of expensive tools. You just need some acrylic paint that you could honestly buy at the dollar store, some paper, a pencil, and then you can use just like a package of barbecue skewers, which is what I've got here. And it works the exact same. I just tend to throw these out afterwards, whereas this is a tool that I can clean and use multiple times. There's my mouse tracks. Another thing that I want to share with everyone today is the spirit bead. Does anyone here know what a spirit bead is? And you can put it in the chat if you do. Nobody? Or you're all being shy? Yeah, so a spirit bead is a bead that is a different color, a different shape. It's somehow distinctly different than what would normally be in your pattern. And it is put there with intention as a way of honoring our mistakes. So it is a humility teaching. It's quite common to see in Métis work, and it's actually really fun to go to museums or archives and look at really old pieces of work and search for that spirit bead. Sometimes it honestly is a mistake, but it comes from that teaching of recognizing that no matter what we do, our beadwork, our artwork will not be perfect because we are humans and we are learning and growing each and every day. And it's an art form that we are constantly working on for the rest of our lives, right? So by intentionally putting that mistake in there, it's a way of honoring that journey that we're on and everything that beadwork and dot art has to teach us. So I always like to throw in a little spirit bead into my work and mention that teaching to people, especially when they're just starting out with dot art or beadwork, because people will sometimes look at another, like they'll look at Christy's work and go, oh, my work is no good compared to hers. Obviously, she's been doing it for a really long time. And so she's gotten better and better and better, right? And the first time we do something, it's not going to be perfect, but every time we do it, it improves and gets better. So I'm going to throw a little blue spirit bead into my red poppy. So you know that you don't usually see blue in poppies. And I'm just trying to lighten it up here so that it sticks out from that black background. Right there. And your spirit bead can go anywhere that you want. It's just where I put it is where it calls to me. When I remember that teaching, I go, that's where I'm going to put it. When it comes to like my poppies, when I bead them, I always put them in the edging. And then I pass that teaching along to whoever is purchasing or who I'm giving the poppy to. And sometimes my poppies, I kind of try to have it over in this area because that's just where it keeps calling to me. But sometimes I'll go all the way around and go, oh, wait, I forgot. And then it will end up on the other side. So it just depends on the day. And if there is a jot that's a little lopsided or it's not quite the way that you wanted, you can always go back over and kind of fix it afterwards just by applying more paint on top. Sometimes people will apply one color, like here we've got this pinky reddish color, and then after it's dry, they'll put another dot on top, sometimes with a different size tool. And that can be a really cool effect too. It kind of reminds me of like white heart beads that have that white center and then like the red outside. So if you want to mimic different styles of beads, you can definitely explore that through painting as well. So there's an example of a finished, semi-finished poppy for you. Just reading in the chat here. Someone shared with us, I like to put my spirit bead in the bead pile. So whenever it picks up accidentally, that is where it goes. I love that. I feel like that truly speaks to the teaching as well. Of just you intentionally put it in your pile and you're going to have it go wherever it goes. So does anybody else have any questions or comments? I can show another piece that I did. Here's another piece that's not quite finished. You can see I still have my pencil markings. And this was inspired by a plant that's growing out in the front part of my yard. So I, again, sat with the plant. Sometimes I'll offer sema or tobacco or sistemau. Sistemau means tobacco in Cree, and I will offer thanks for the plant, knowing that I kind of explaining that intention to the plant. So yes, I do talk to plants, and just saying like, I'm here to learn from you, and I'm here to sit with you and be inspired by you to create some beautiful art, whether it be beadwork or whether it be painting. And so this is a piece that I started, I still have to finish. And then sometimes I'll go and I have the name of the plant down here and learn a little bit more about any medicinal properties that are associated with that plant, where it is commonly seen. And so for me, this form of art has really allowed me to connect deeper with the land. I often do this, or I started doing this with my beadwork as well. And it's a really nice way of kind of going back to where my ancestors drew their inspiration, because it was coming from the land. Those floral patterns were from their backyard. So now taking that and drawing inspiration for my own backyard or front yard. So that's another example. And similar to the sage that I spent time with and then kind of interpreted into a piece. And then there's another one here. And there's this one that is inspired by another one of those medicine pouches. So this is another one where I did the tufting, and I actually did a tufting workshop on, it was on Wednesday? Yeah, on Wednesday here for X Education Week. So I'm not sure if anybody here was able to attend that. But this is a piece that, you know, I did the beadwork first and then I tufted it second. Because like I was explaining earlier, I do all of my outlines and I do my fill last. And then I sketched it out and turned it into a piece of dot art. It's not perfect, obviously. There's a few blotchy spots, but every time I pick up this type of work, it gets a little bit better in different areas. But yeah. And here's another poppy that I started, but I just need to do the fill for. Another really fun thing to do is exploring different tools and incorporating them in. So for example, the end of a pin has this ball on it, depending on what kind of pins you buy, obviously. And this type of tool can create larger dots. Whereas if you were to use something like a toothpick, the end is really small, so it creates smaller dots. And it can become really interesting if you combine these different sizes, just like combining different sizes of beads. Like this is your size 8, maybe this is your size 15. So that's also something that you can explore within this work. One tip that I would say, if you are using pins, it can be a little tricky to hold on to these little guys. You don't want to accidentally stab yourself with the end. And so what I do is I take the end of an eraser and I poke it in there. And then this becomes like an extended stylus. And that's how I use it to create my dots. So that's just a little tip for you. There's another Métis artist, and his name is Brian Kahn. I'll find his website. There, I've linked it in the chat now. And he uses the end of a pin, but the way that he does it is he puts the end into the end of a feather. And then that becomes his tool for painting. So he's got this feather to hold on to, just like a nice little pen, right? If you were writing with it. So that's how he does his paintings. And Christy does hers with knitting needles of various different sizes. So that's why I started using one of these. But you can really use anything. Like you could even use the end of this eraser, right? Or a stylus or anything that has a circular or round end to it, right? I'm seeing in the chat that someone was able to come to the tufting class and learn a little bit. I hope that, yeah, that you get to try it out yourself as well. So I see here we have about 20 minutes left. I actually was thinking of maybe showing you some of Brian's work. I've showed you some of Christy's work, but I wonder if I can share, yeah, I can share my screen with you all. Oops. Make sure I share the right one. There we go. So this is Brian Kahn's website, briankahn.com. And he is an artist that lives in Niagara. And there's a few different pieces that I wanted to just take a look at to show you some other examples of dot art. So you'll see again that a lot of these pieces are done on a black background. He's got the vines that are connecting different elements. These ones don't have mouse tracks, but in some of his pieces, I believe he does have mouse tracks in them. Like you can see a little bit here, but it's not that V symmetry, but he's got a little bit of that kind of thing going on. So this piece down here is called We Aspire, and it's inspired by the Métis Nation of Ontario's anthem titled We Aspire. And one thing that I wanted to point out about this piece, I mean, you'll notice the symmetry, but it's the infinity symbol in the middle. So with Métis people, we are a joining of two different cultures that came together during a very specific time during the fur trade. So for myself, I mentioned that I'm Cree-Métis. So what that means is there was Cree women in my family who married French and English men. And together, they came together and created Métis children. And that culture kind of carried on. So you'll see elements of First Nations culture and of European culture in Métis artwork and Métis traditions and whatnot. So I mentioned that a lot of our work is inspired by the land, but there are some inspirations that we took and still take from things like stained glass designs, European embroidery designs, and things like that. The reason that I'm sharing this is because this infinity symbol has become a symbol that you'll often see when it comes to Métis people. It's on our flags, it's all over the place. But what does it represent? And it represents those two joinings of the cultures together to infinity, right? So that's what that symbol represents. There's a lot of other different stories that come along with this symbol. Some say that there's stories about horses running in that shape, that I'm not too familiar with the details with it, but there's lots of different stories. Even with the flags, you'll notice some flags are blue and some are red, and there's different stories associated with that. I just wanted to highlight that symbol. Another piece I wanted to talk about is this beautiful orange piece. So this is the only piece on this page that is not done on a black background, and it's very intentional. And I'm sure you can probably guess, even without reading, that this has a connection to Orange Shirt Day, which is coming up on September 30th. Orange Shirt Day is a day to listen to survivors and their families, to acknowledge those who didn't survive the residential school system. And so this piece, I actually had the opportunity of interviewing Brian Kahn last year for a program with Harbourfront Center on Orange Shirt Day. And in that interview, which is actually available online if anyone wants to check it out, he talks about the inspiration for this particular piece. So you'll notice that this piece is not symmetrical. And the reason is because this piece was inspired by a photograph. And all of the little flowers down here represent the children in those photographs. And inside of these flowers, you'll notice these brown dots, which represents the eyes of the children. You'll also notice these flowers up here hanging upside down with the cross, and those represent the nuns in the photograph. They're hung in a particular way to depict the experiences of residential schools. You'll also notice in this corner over here, a dream catcher with the 4 directions on it to represent that culture that is slowly fading away through the residential school system. We know that Indigenous people are resilient, and so the culture didn't go away entirely. So that dream catcher is still there, even though it's a little bit lighter. And on the bottom here, you'll see the 2-row wampum belt, which is a treaty agreement between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee. And it represents the Indigenous people traveling in one direction in their canoe, the Europeans in another in their ship, in 2 straight lines beside each other, but not interfering and not crossing. So allowing each culture to walk their own paths in life and really celebrate their own cultures without trying to interfere or change one another. It's a really important agreement to acknowledge, especially when it comes to the stories of residential school, because those stories, or sorry, the residential school system was designed to kill the Indian and the child, right? So it's important to acknowledge that we shouldn't, or not we, but they shouldn't have tried to do that, right? So yeah, those are some of the stories in this piece. He has a few other pieces as well that are not on Black backgrounds, and they all have very compelling stories to go along with them. This is another one called Echoes of Silence, and it's a tribute to honor MMIWG, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So that's why it's done on red, but you can actually see the symmetry in this piece. So yeah, I just thought I'd share a few other examples of some dot art as well. And I'm just popping back in the chat to see, does anybody have any questions or want to share how their work is coming along, or if they want to share their work with us? Oh, you're all very quiet. I can share a few more of Christy's work with you. I'll just put this off to the side so I don't get paint on her book. So this book was produced through the, I believe, Thunder Bay Art Gallery. It's a beautiful book that has a lot of like stories that go along with the works as well. But I'll just show you some more examples. So here's another beautiful piece. And this one, sometimes with Christy's work, she'll combine dot art with, I don't know what the right word is, but more like the type of paintings you would more commonly see, where you're actually taking a brush stroke, right? This piece, it looks like, I know it's probably hard for you to see on the screen, but it looks like this one is all done in dots. And her work is very much rooted in the land, right? Is another really beautiful piece. And you can really see that symmetry. If you were to divide it in half, it's not entirely symmetrical. Like these two bees are sitting a little bit more off to this side. So there is occasions where you'll notice those few little things, but the general idea of that symmetry comes through quite often. Oh yes, yeah, she had a lot of these pieces, I think actually that are in the book were exhibited at the McMichael Gallery. There was an exhibit in person, but like mentioned in the chat, that exhibit was also available online. Do you know if it's still available online or if it's over now? Just gonna pose that question. Oh, okay, yeah, the exhibit's probably over. I see a question here that says, you know how the first one comes out kind of wonky. Are you referring to the first dot, or can you be a little bit more specific of what you mean there? And this one's not done in dot art. This is like regular brush strokes, but there are a few dots here and there that are in there. Yeah, so the scale of, I mean, in the book, it's quite small, right? Which also makes it harder for you to really see the details of the work. But in person, these works are massive. Like they're the height or the length of me really, and I'm about 5'4". So they're really, really big pieces, but it makes sense, right? Like when you're doing your dot art, you'll notice that even if you have a small tool, like you need a lot of, or like one dot can fill up a significant amount of space, right? So when you have all these different flowers and plants and animals that are in the paintings, to tell a beautiful story, they do take up a large amount of space. If anybody ever has the opportunity to see either of these artists in person, I would highly recommend it. And I actually, the one thing I forgot to share about Brian Kahn's work, Forgotten, is that that piece toured a number of schools as part of an educational program that he was doing. And students would actually go up and touch the painting, which for anybody who's an artist, you know that like you're not supposed to touch other people's artwork, especially paintings. But they were kids, and so they went up and touched it because the way that the paint dries, it often is a little bit raised, right? And so if you actually, once my work is dry, I can run my hands over it and it will almost feel like braille. Like you can feel those little bumps. So once your piece is dry, it's kind of neat to do that. but yeah, so these kids started touching the paintings, which at first he was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But over time, these little fingerprints started appearing on the canvas. And so he actually coated the canvas with a sealant to protect the fingerprints. And with some time, he started to realize that those fingerprints interacting with the painting were almost like an intergenerational conversation and exchange. And so he's protected those little fingerprints as part of that conversation, which I think is really beautiful. And I would love to see the work in person to actually be able to see those tiny little fingerprints, because you can't tell on the online version. But yeah, that's another story that goes along with that piece. So I'm just seeing to the earlier question. It says it's the whole thing. The first time you try a new technique, it doesn't quite come out the way you planned. Yes, yeah. So that's again why I share that that spirit bead teaching, because it's important to recognize that no matter how much you plan, things happen. And even the piece I demoed tonight, like, it's not perfect, but it's part of my journey of getting better and better, right? So it's also a reminder not to be hard on yourself. I think it's really easy, especially for artists, to be like, we're our worst critics. But keeping that teaching in our back pockets, in the front of our minds, kind of gives some peace of mind and some sense of ease. I know since that teaching has been introduced to me, I tend to kind of relax a little bit more. When I see a bead that's not quite sitting right, it still bothers me, but it allows me to forgive myself, that, you know, it's okay that it's not perfect. And seeing in the chat, the exhibition ended in April with Christy Belcourt, and the virtual tour was live, but they had an artist talk video, which was an hour long, on their website. And then they linked the website mcmichaels.com/events/uprising if anyone wants to look at that. I see another comment that says, I would so love to see them in person. I think there's a large reproduction of one of her pieces locally in Picton, Ontario. And then another person shared, thanks for sharing Christy and Brian's work and the symbolism and depth in each. Sounds so immersive to see them in person. Yeah, hopefully in the future, when this whole pandemic thing ends, we'll be able to see art in real life as well. So I think we just have a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions. The actual demo was pretty quick today. I picked quite a simple flower to do, so that went by a little bit quicker. So we have some time for questions if there are any. Does anybody want to share their paintings if they were painting along? Or is everyone scared because we're recording this? Oh, I see someone's work. Oh, that's beautiful. Very nice. Did you do it with paint or did you do it with markers? I'm having trouble seeing.
Oh, it's paint.
Oh, nice. Beautiful. I like the leaves too.
Yeah, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just kind of
I like it.
Winging it as I went.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for this. This has been a blast.
Oh, good. Does anyone else want to share? That's okay. Well, maybe if there's no other questions, I think we'll probably wrap up the session now. If you do have any questions in the future, my Instagram is at Magneson Studios, Magneson Studios. And please feel free, even if you're watching this later after this live has gone out on YouTube, and you have a question, you want to share your work, please tag me, message me. Always happy to answer questions or even see what you've made. It makes my day when I get to see what people made. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Marissa, for joining us this week. And thank you to everyone for coming today. We do have a lot of virtual programming that has been pre-recorded and is on YouTube, and our powwow went live today, so you can check that out too. And for sure, look at our website because Marissa is one of our vendors, and also you can find her on Instagram. So I will stop recording now and just close the session. Thank you so much to everyone.